part of getting to build consensus among each other in terms of understanding what's happening in the topics that we discuss here. And so today we are discussing the Zimbabwe debt restructuring process, which began sometime in 2022. We know that former Mozambican President Joaquim Chissano is playing a key role in that process. So does the Africa Development Bank. A number of European countries. We know the Americans pulled out in January, I think January 29, citing problems with the Zimbabwean elections in 2023. But we know that this process has been touted at its beginning as the only game in town from civil society colleagues who would know that it was touted as the only game in town because it was seen as a game changer in terms of addressing some of the challenges that Zimbabwe has been facing for a very long time. And so today we brought different people with different experience or interactions with the process to try and help us unpack it, understand it, and help us make an informed judgment on whether this process is making progress or not. So we have people that have been interacting with the process from its beginning. We have people that are in the process as of now. We also have people that have been following the process more closely and would understand the issues at stake more strongly and more intensely. But we know that in the discussions, we have many other people that are well informed and have been following this process who are not on the panel, who would be able to come in, ask probing questions, all this for us to be able to understand what's happening. And I don't want to waste time. I want to get right into the discussion. And I want to bring Vera Msara, who is, of course, I think it's the first time she's been on this. She's coming to this platform. And Vera, welcome. Hope to see more of you in the coming days. Vera is the executive director. Hello?
Hi, Munjotsi. I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just about to introduce you and say Vera is the executive director of the NGO Forum. And she's a lawyer, has been a part of these kind of discussions for the past 20 years or so. So we have a very informed voice, but also she sits a process in Zimbabwe. And so Vera, we wanted to ask you to really just unpack for us what this process is about. What does it intend to achieve? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much, Munjotsi, and a very good morning to everyone from wherever you are joining. Like Munjotsi said, my name is Vera Msara. I'm a lawyer by profession. I'm currently at a conference, so if you hear any noises in the background, please do excuse the background noise. So essentially, this process, which I am a part of, started in 2022. I say that it started in 2022, but I think discussions were ongoing within the development sector, of which I was a part of, prior to 2022. And as we all know, currently it's being initiated and managed by the African Development Bank. And ADB is working very closely with the relevant government departments, as well as civil society. And I'm one of the civil society representatives in the process. So I think the first thing we might ask ourselves is, why is this such a crucial and critical process for the country? As we all know from recent figures, the country's public debt is unsustainable. Moreover, there is need for us to look at our macroeconomic fundamentals, and also just social protection, given the El Nino that we are currently experiencing, not just in Zimbabwe, but in the SADC region as well. So there's a lot of issues on why this process is critical for all of us to know, and why it's important for the public as well to know about this, and potentially why it could be a game changer for the country as the country moves forward. The way that the process is structured is that it's supposed to dovetail the National Development Strategy 1. So it dovetails NDS 1. A lot of the reforms that are outlined in many ways mirror and try to look at what government's own objectives are in terms of the country. So I think in many ways it's great because we are not duplicating, we are in many ways complementing the country's own trajectory. So that's the first thing that I wanted to raise. We currently have 3 tracks in which we are looking at reforms within the country. One of them is the governance group, which I am a part of. The other one is economic reforms, and the other one is land. So those are the 3 reform areas that the process seeks to work on with a specific methodological approach. And I think for me, that's really key. So it is a structured dialogue, but it has a methodology to it. And I think the methodology is born out of not just the need for key reforms, but also international best practices. What are international best practices around reforms in all these critical areas? So we currently have 3 indices, 3 international indices that we are using to measure whether or not the government is making progress in terms of the reforms. Those 3 include the Mo Ibrahim, which I'm sure we are all familiar with. We also have the World Justice Program Rule of Law Index. And finally, we have the Transparency International CPI Index, which I'm sure we're all aware of. Now, to date, we've managed to train government on the Rule of Law Index. Efforts are underway to enhance understanding and knowledge on why these 3 indices are critical for the country. And also efforts are underway to look at what might need to be contextualized so it meets our specific environment and our specific context, whilst, like I say, still mirroring international best practice. So we're glad that at least we've managed to do some of the trainings. Discussions are still underway for the other trainings, and government departments have been trained on these indices that will assist us to measure the key reforms that the country wants to implement. That said, because I'm part of the governance group, maybe in the interest of time, I will just focus a little bit on the governance. This year, when I joined the group, a technical group was set up, a technical working group, which I'm a part of. And really, I think a lot of us have a lot of experience in the international industry around reforms. So it brings together government ministries, development partners, international development partners, as well as civil society in the country to look at what progress we are making on those indices that I just described. So under governance, we have 5 key thematic areas. And these thematic areas, I think, will not only be of interest to all of us because we work on them, but I think they are really instrumental in terms of measuring whether or not the country is making progress. And a lot of these thematic areas also touch on some of the other themes that I mentioned. So the 3 tracks, economic and land. So you will find that there's a lot of complementarity and there's a lot of cross-sectionality between all these key areas. For the governance, the areas that we are focusing on include judicial reforms, so looking at the role of the judiciary, elections in the country. It also includes human rights. It also includes national unity and peace. And it finally also includes transparency and accountability, so anti-corruption. And that's why I said you will find that there's a lot of cross-sectionality between our focus thematic areas, as well as what the others are doing in the other tracks. So maybe in the interest of time, because I'm sure my 5 minutes is about to end, the key question everybody might have is, what progress are we making? I think it's unfortunate that a lot of what we are doing is not being publicized. So I do think that government needs to do more in terms of sharing information on what's going on in this critical national process. To date, we have had meetings throughout these key areas, civil society, international partners, as well as the government, to discuss the matrix that we have. We have a matrix, a monitoring and evaluation matrix that we are using to monitor progress, including indicators. So like I said, it's not haphazard, it is methodological, and it is intentional in terms of trying to measure whether or not there is progress in these key reform areas. So we have met under all those 5 thematic areas that I just described. From my end, I think a couple of things to note. We are seeing progress with government in some of these areas. I thought today I would just touch on a few in the interest of time, and I'm sure we'll continue to discuss them as we move along. So I will touch very briefly on enhancing justice delivery in the country. As you can anticipate, some of the issues we have been discussing is the need for impartiality of the judicial system, as well as the need to ensure due process and that the rights of accused persons are protected, as well as fundamental freedoms that are also instrumental in the judicial process, which includes freedom of assembly and freedom of association. Some of the progress we have seen, so we met with government. Government was represented by key institutions, including the Judicial Services Commission, the National Prosecuting Authority, the Zimbabwe Republic Police, as well as colleagues from the Ministry of Justice. And certainly, I think in particular with the Judicial Services Commission, we have seen a lot happening under that front. The JSC recently introduced a full implementation of an integrated electronic case management system, which it hopes and everybody hopes will go a long way to ensure that those who are facing prosecution, their trials happen in a much shorter period of time. So I will talk about that. We also all know about the Independent Complaints Commission, which we feel is really critical, and the efforts that are underway to make sure that is operationalized within our country. So I'll touch on that for today, but like I said, there's a lot that's happening. We are seeing government opening up a little more, sharing more information with us as those that are involved in the development process. So I think in terms of open government, this process provides a safe environment for us to be able to raise critical reform issues and be able to do it freely and to speak freely. So I do think that it's an important national process. I'm just touching on those 2, but
Sorry. I muted you accidentally when I was trying to mute someone else. Vera?
Yes,
Thanks.
no worries. So I was saying maybe for today, I will end there for now. There are other critical reforms that are underway. But like I say, I think part of the challenge we have is that a lot of this information is not being shared widely and broadly, but rest assured that everybody who's involved, including international partners, the African Development Bank and civil society, as well as the government representatives, are committed, and we have been in attendance and participating freely. So maybe I'll hand over to my other colleagues now to jump in. Thanks.
Thank you, Vera, for I think what is an important input into the discussion in terms of giving us its makeup and the progress that you are making. And I think that, as you say, some of the things is communication and ownership as well, whether citizens feel that they own this process or it has anything to do with their conditions. And I think that those things, the gap could be bridged through more communication. But you touched on a number of things. The first thing is to know that this process dovetails with the NDS1. And so it is not just coming out of the blue. It's a methodological process, very structured in terms of what it is supposed to do, at least from what we are hearing from you. The pillar around governance of delivering justice or enhancing justice delivery, a very important pillar. And I'm sure that there will be more questions in the discussions around issues of progress and whether the reforms are taking root, but also the timelines. At what point is this process envisaged to come to an end? So I want Beloved Chiweshe is the Deputy Director of the Accountability Lab in Zimbabwe. Bila, I know that at the beginning of this process, you were a part of people that were working on this process, but also I know you have kept following on the process. I want you to add in less than 5 minutes some of the things that will make us understand this process, what it intended to achieve, that Vera might have skipped, or another thing that you think will be useful for the discussion. Beloved.
I think my video is disabled from that end, but I hope you can hear me. Confirm, Mujodzi.
Yes, I can hear you, Bill.
Okay, that's fine. And thank you to Mujodzi and SALO for availing this opportunity for us to discuss this important process, which actually provided opportunity for Zimbabwe to have escaped the debt trap in which we are. Of interest to note is the fact that the challenges we face regarding this debt are actually due to the interests that are accumulating as a result of the debt that we incurred a long time ago. So the idea was in recognition that these arrears, if they continue to balloon, it's likely that Zimbabwe is not going to pay anyway, or is going to struggle to pay. So how do we create conditions which allow Zimbabwe to escape this debt trap in meaningful ways? So our approach more from a political side, because I'm coming from my background, having interacted with this process, as someone who was working in one of the embassies, which was engaged in this process, but in the political division. So you will forgive my skewedness towards the politics of it and less of the technical and the economic elements of it. So the first point that I would want to make is that there is seemingly unmet expectations on both sides. So when the government engaged on this process, they were expectations that were not met. First, I think there was an expectation that resources or this process was going to move in less conditionality-based arrangements. I think that's one. And then on the other side, you appreciate that from the West, the citizens there, they are more interested in accountability, and they ask difficult questions to elected and appointed officials. So the West group knew that whatever process that they would engage in, they would need concrete answers to give to their citizens. So I want to contrast these two interests between the government and the West. They needed tangible evidence of reform, which they could sell to their capitals and to their citizens was the basis on which a debt structuring process was being undertaken. So you will see that during the time that I was there were also two groups. One which was a Zimbabwe positivist group, and the Zim skeptics, who did not believe in government's willingness to reform, government's willingness to undertake economic and political reforms. This group was very strong. It brought facts, it brought the analysis and data from their intelligence. And then there was the other group, which was the group that thought it was important to give Zimbabwe a chance. Unfortunately, this group, from my reading, they had less facts, more. They had a heart, while the other group had facts. Unfortunately, I try to go back to the topic that we had. I think Zimbabwe missed a wonderful opportunity to have used this process. As we speak right now, Namatai Kwekweza, Robson Chere, and Samuel Gwenzi were taken off a plane welcoming to a conference in Victoria Falls. Those are processes which dent these processes. I'm just giving this one as an example because it's most recent. During the time this process was being crafted, surprising things happened, which made development partners question Zimbabwe's interest in the process. I think there were a number of arrests and detentions and some difficult decisions which government made, which made development partners to question. So I think I have highlighted the issue of unmet expectations. I've highlighted the issue of government's lack of seeming lack of interest in the process. I want to thank my sister Vera for bringing forth the processes that are being happening there, some of which that I was not aware of. But I think it goes to the very same reason that if government had interest in ensuring that it succeeds, I think greater communication would have been done with the citizens so that people are aware what is happening within that space. So in a nutshell, I think we lost an opportunity because there was commitment among the development partners to see how if Zimbabwe implemented some political and economic reforms, that could be then supported through a parallel process which could help Zimbabwe. Unfortunately, in the governance pillar, one of the key indicators was the election itself. Those skeptics had joined the pessimists on the basis that let's see how the election goes. And they had gotten the guarantees from Adesina, from Chisano, from the president himself, that the election was going to be conducted in a manner that would demonstrate their commitment as had it been put on paper. But contrary to that, I think let's also base it on facts, which is essentially the SADC election observer mission report, which pointed irregularities and said that the election did not meet the standards set forth in the law and in the SADC and regional instruments that govern the conduct of election in the region. So by us missing that indicator of the election process, I think the governance pillar became difficult to then report as a success. In then closing, I also want to mention that the governance pillar came later on. Initially, it began as a technical process, which was more or less a technical process. But the donors, especially the Zim skeptics, they insisted that we cannot have a technical process which is not accompanied by a political process, hence the emergence of this governance pillar. I think, Munjozi, I'll end here. And if there are any questions, I think we'll take them at a later stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. I think that you're having been in the process at the beginning is helpful because we need to understand how the process came to be. And I think you highlight that some of the pillars like the governance came in a bit later because it was just a technical process to address the debt process. and then a lot of other actors had to bring in a lot of things so that it become a bit holistic. And I think that in itself, the genesis of the process is a discussion on its own that can take a very long time, which I think speaks to some of the things that Vera was touching on, that information is not being shared, but also translate to lack of ownership from the discussions you have with people by many Zimbabweans, because very few would know where it's coming from, where it's going, and what it is supposed to do. And I think you touch on some of the important things of what is happening at the moment vis-a-vis the intents of this process, that you have to marry the reality on the ground and the intended objectives that are in the process itself on paper. And I think you are contrasting those things quite clearly. But it would be good to know from Vera at some point whether the guys who were the positivist and those who were pessimistic at the beginning are still in the process, in the same groups, or things you have been coming closer to each other in the past few years as you get to trust and build confidence on each other. But thanks, Bila, for the input. I want to quickly move. Honorable Chidua rather has not been able to join us yet, but I'm hoping that we might be able to have him at some point because he was deputy minister when this process began. And I think his insight would be useful, but also he chairs currently the portfolio committee on budgeting. But I want to bring in Zimbabwe's former Minister of Finance, Honorable Tendai Biti, who has been an important voice in terms of financial issues, but also from a political point of view in Zimbabwe. And I know that he's been following this process, and we would be honored to hear what he thinks from the input of the people that have been interacting with the process. We know that when he was chairing the Public Accounts Committee in Parliament, he might have interacted with some of the things that are on discussion today. So Mkoma Tendai, I want you to come in, help us unpack these things in terms of where are we vis-a-vis the debt restructuring process and the reality that we find ourselves in Zimbabwe. When are we likely to see the fruits of this process, if we are to see any? But more importantly, it has been laid by Vera and Bila that part of this process, what is supposed to achieve are reforms. Are we closer to seeing these reforms being achieved? Yeah, so please do come in and put your inputs.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me. Can you confirm you can hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you clearly.
Yeah, thank you so much. I can't start my video. The Wi-Fi in Zimbabwe is a problem. So if I can just hide my ugly face and you can hear my voice. So
no, that's fine.
Yeah, the story of trying to unlock and deal with Zimbabwe's unsustainable debt situation, Zimbabwe's debt overhang, Zimbabwe's debt distress is a long story. Is a long story that has been going on, and the current structured dialogue platform led by President of the African Development Bank, Adesina, and which also ropes in former President of Mozambique, Joaquim Chissano, is the latest episode in Zimbabwe's attempt to deal with this debt overhang, unsustainable debt overhang. I think our debt at the present moment is almost 90% of GDP when the threshold is 70%. So it is unacceptable. It is too high. I think with great respect, the current structured dialogue effort is dead by the shouting, by the little meetings that are still being held. And I say this with great respect to everyone on this platform who is participating in those processes. And what has killed this latest debt reform structure is the lack of desire to actually implement the required structural reform that can actually bring an outcome of debt cancellation and debt resolution in Zimbabwe. There has been no desire at all to implement the required reform. In fact, I would submit that given the political context of Zimbabwe, given the fact that politics subordinates anything in Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe, as it currently stands, is unable to implement the necessary reforms that are required for any successful debt cancellation and debt forgiveness exercise. And I want to take you back to history. The Lima process, 8 October 2015, then Minister of Finance Chinamasa persuades literally everyone in the international community that Zimbabwe can implement reforms, that Zimbabwe can meet the quantitative and qualitative targets of an upper tier staff monitored program. Some creditors were skeptical, in particular the United States of America, but everyone sank in lock, stock, and barrel supporting this process. And you will recall that one of the countries that was at the forefront in grabbing Zimbabwe's hands, and one of the countries that was prepared to godfather Zimbabwe or grandmother Zimbabwe. As you know, these discussions, whether it's the Lima process or the structured platform process, are all intended to fit in, to dovetail in the HIPIC multilateral debt relief process of the G7, of the World Bank, and the IMF. So two things are required. The first is the structural economic reform. The second is the political reform. And if you tick all the boxes, countries will forgive, countries will cancel your debt. So the underlying word here is willingness to reform. And just going back to the Lima process, what killed the Lima process essentially was the undisclosed mendacious introduction of the bond note on the 4th of May 2016, when Zimbabwe had gone to the IMF board on the 2nd of May 2016. He had not disclosed that there would be a bond note, and everyone was angry in the international community that how can you make a structural reform such as introduction of a currency without disclosing the same to us. The current process, and I want to deal with the three pillars of this program, which is the economy, which is governance, and which is the land question. There's been no reform at all on the economic side. In fact, if you read Munjodzi, if you read the latest midterm review that was presented last week on Thursday, there is absolutely no mention at all of the structural dialogue platform in that statement, meaning that even the government itself accepts that this thing is dead. There's not been a high-level structured meetings, those high-level fancy meetings that we saw in Cote d'Ivoire, that we saw in Zimbabwe, attended by the President of the Republic in 2024. More than that, the IMF approved a staff-monitored program for Zimbabwe last year in 2023. The government of Zimbabwe has not moved at all in defining quantitative targets in defining qualitative targets. I'm using the technical terms, and I will not explain unless you in a question and answer, because I want to utilize the time. So forgive me for being technical. Not only that, Zimbabwe has refused the IMF to publish the Article 4 consultation report that took place in 2022. So that is malified, that is bona fide, because an Article 4 consultation is an in-depth examination of the economy. It's like a medical examination in which a physician tests your vitals, and if the patient, in this case Zimbabwe, refuses the publication of an Article 4 consultation, that is acting in bad faith. So Zimbabwe is failing basic elementary requirements of transparency around economic governance. But I want to come to disturbing issues. Firstly is the money printing that this government has been doing, including the serious growth in broad money supply that runs into thousands of percentage. That on its own is not the problem, but attempting to hide these deficits becomes the problem. For a long time, our Minister of Finance has boasted and spoken of surpluses. Now we know from the audit reports that there's been no surpluses at all, that there have been huge deficits in debt when books of accounts have been closed opaquely. We know from the 2023 audit report that in 2022, $534 billion was spent outside the Parliament, outside the budget, outside the appropriation account. 534 billion comes to 400% expenditure outside Parliament. We know in 2023 that 8.7 trillion was spent outside an original budget of $2.7 trillion, and the Auditor General puts the percentage of that over expenditure to 241%. For 2021, 641% was spent outside the public finance management system, outside Parliament, outside the Blue Book, outside the appropriation account. Now it's one thing failing to live within your means, which is a basic elementary requirement of economics. You need to balance your books, you need to live within your means. It's another thing then hiding the figures, as our government has been doing, and also breaching the Zimbabwean Constitution. Section 305 of the Zimbabwean Constitution says that if you overspend, you go and submit a supplementary budget to cover your expenditure. Section 307 of the Zimbabwean Constitution says if you overspend and spend outside Parliament, you go and submit a bill of condonation asking Parliament to forgive you of your sins of over expenditure within 60 days from the date you became aware of your over expenditure. Now in this country, since 2015 to now, the government of Zimbabwe has been spending outside Parliament, and I can give you, if you wanted me, if I had time, I'll give you the exact figures from 2015. They have not gone to Parliament to seek condonation. There were two condonation bills, one for 2019, which sought to condone $10.7 billion spent outside Parliament for 2015, 2016, and 2017. That bill died a natural death. There was a condonation bill for 2022, which sought to condone government over expenditure for 2019 in the sum of 100 billion Zimbabwean dollars and 6 billion Zimbabwean dollars for 2020. That bill died a natural death. So the long and short of it is that Zimbabwe is even failing to comply with its own constitution, to comply with its own laws. And you can't persuade anyone to debt cancel and to forgive you. So deficit financing is a problem. The second governance issue is, of course, the mismanagement of the exchange rate. With collapsed currencies and changed currencies like diapers, the RTGS dollar, by the time it collapsed, the exchange rate was almost 1:100,000. The ZiG was introduced as recent as the 5th of April 2024. I'm told right now is trading at anything between 26 to 30. And the reason why it is collapsing is again misgovernance, a printing of money. The recent midterm budget disclosed that they've already spent 4.2 billion ZiG on roads and infrastructure. Yet the budget of the Ministry of Finance for the whole year is $1.7 billion. So any Zimbabwean knows that by the end of 2024, we will have over expenditure, unapproved expenditure that will be running into billions. That will be at least 300% of the original budget. So this is not sustainable. But the major issue that Zimbabwe will fail in any attempt to reform is, of course, corruption. There is massive looting. There is massive rampant corruption and state capture. Just recently, $1.6 billion was paid by the government through the Mutapa Fund to some so-called shareholders of Kuvimba. The transaction is opaque. The transaction smells of illegality. And that's one example. And every day you hardly open a newspaper without reading a story of abuse, whether it's goats that are bought for 89 million whether it's the fire ambulances that local authorities don't need that are bought for $500 million, whether it's unlawful acquisitions of banks and so forth. We with respect to South Africa and Nigeria, we've truly become the corruption capital of sub-Saharan Africa, and our ratings on the anti-corruption index and our ratings on the Gini coefficient, the inequality thing, confirms that. Then, of course, is corruption around our minerals, lithium, chrome, diamonds, and so forth. It's a dog's breakfast. The massive corruption, the massive looting of our resources. Then you've got another disturbing thing, which is securitization of our minerals. Minerals being used to secure our indebtedness, particularly indebtedness to the African Import and Export Bank, Afrexim Bank. So in a nutshell, we are failing on the economic front. We are failing to meet the test. We are not following up on the SMP. And the SMP is the basic entry point. The SMP is the basic entry point. We have failed the last 3 SMPs. We have failed. And this government, and Mr. Mthuli Ncube, is given up. As I said, the IMF approved an SMP last year, but no one is talking about. Governance issues, I can spend the whole day talking about them. As I'm talking to you right now, Jameson Timber and 77 young people have been in prison for over 3 months for nothing, for trying to have a meeting to commemorate International Youth Day on the 16th of June, 2024, at Jameson Timber's residence. As I'm talking to you right now, Job Scala has spent 2 years in prison on charges that the High Court confirms were not charges at all, were fictitious, charges at all. So there's authoritarian consolidation. There's massive destruction of institutions. Look at the way that Parliament has been emasculated by an imposter who has fired members of Parliament, left, right, and center, to leave Parliament crippled. I'm a lawyer. I have to be careful what I can say about the judiciary. But the fact of the matter is that there are massive challenges in the judiciary. There are huge complaints about the recently appointed judges by members of the public. So every institution in this country has been crippled and emasculated, including the constitution, including things that are essential to actualize the constitution. Take devolution. Billions of dollars are being given through devolution. But the government, despite numerous court orders, have not enacted the law actualizing devolution. Provincial councils have not been appointed that are required in terms of the law. So devolution politically has been killed by non-implementation, but financially monies are being distributed, and devolution funds have therefore become a private source of looting. And one of the challenges about the structured dialogue platform on its governance issues, there were 5 issues that my Mbuya Vera Msara spoke of: judicial reform, elections, human rights, transparency, and so forth. But in Zimbabwe, unless you add security sector reform, forget about whatever you are doing. It's a complete waste of time. For all intents and purposes, this has become a militarized state, a securitized state. Look at the statements that the generals are making. Look at the statement that was made by Sanyatwe only 2 or 3 weeks ago in Mutare. So without security sector reform, the governance, a matrix of this program is a complete, waste of time. Then I come to elections. I think that many people were prepared to give Zimbabwe the benefit of the doubt if it was able to deliver a decent election. It failed to deliver a decent election, so much so that SADC, of all bodies, issued a damning report on the election that was held on the 23rd of August last year. The delimitation process was flawed. Was the archetype, gerrymandering. So we have failed on all those fronts. So to conclude, the structured dialogue platform reform is dead. Adesina is on his way out. I think the elections for a new president will take place next year. The government has stopped talking about the same, and for the simple and good reason that this government cannot reform, and no government and no political party has ever reformed its way out of power. It won't happen, and ZANU-PF will not be the first party to do that. I will stop here.
Thank you, Mkoma, for, I think, what is a very loaded input into the discussion. And I think that at some point during the discussion, of course, Vera will have to come back and get into detail in terms of some of these things that you highlight. But clearly, there is unwillingness from your input of the government to reform, and there is no commitment in terms of wanting to see this process succeed. You touched on every metric on the pillar that from what is on the ground, we are failing to measure to every metric that we have put for ourselves as a measure of success. The structured monitoring plan of the IMF is not being respected. We are failing it. All of them that have been put on the table. Lack of compliance on simple and elementary things that are put on the table, corruption, and on the governance issue, that when you are running a debt restructuring process, that has governance as its pillar, and during the same period, you have an opposition political leader spending 2 years in jail, 78 young people, including, of course, Mkoma Timba, being arrested for commemorating an event at a private residence. But also you touch very importantly on the elephant in the room, that if the debt restructuring program does not have a way to incorporate security sector reform, we are unlikely just chasing air, and we are unlikely to succeed. The benefits that people had given Zimbabwe, if it had delivered an election that was decent, was squandered. That goodwill was squandered. The election was chaotic. And you conclude by saying the process is dead for all intents and purposes. And I think that's a huge indictment to the process. And of course, I know Vera will come back at some point, but I want to move to Chennai. You have had these inputs, Chennai, and I wanted you to come in and help us shed more light. Is this process dead, as Tendai puts it, or as Vera puts it, there is progress that has not been communicated properly? Where do you sit?
So how I feel, Njodzi, is that the process was flawed from the beginning. I feel that the idea of having the matrices almost being applied simultaneously kind of ignores the problem statement. I feel like it has been, and it was interesting to hear Beloved mention that at the start of it, this was actually looked at as a technical debt restructuring process. And so I think from the beginning, the approach to this has not been right. And I think we are starting to see the fact that, as Tendai has said, is dead in the water. It really is because they've not really addressed the problem statement fully. And therefore, what hasn't happened is we haven't had the right starting point. It really should be, for all intents and purposes, a stepped process that gathers momentum as it goes along, right? And I'll try and explain what I mean by this. So when you look at the problem statement for Zimbabwe, yes, debt exists. We have a runaway debt overhang. We have we've got no productive value, or indeed reduced. The idea of financial leakages that Tendai has highlighted in terms of corruption really points to deeply rooted systemic governance issues. And this idea of that, is their willingness to reform. And, I like to give the example of someone fighting an addiction to borrow from the social scientists. Is when someone comes to you because they're addicted to debt that they can't pay back, they're addicted to borrowing and not really showing much for what they've borrowed. You do not address the issue by helping them financially. You address the addiction, you address the root problem, you address the systemic governance issues. And there's never really a willingness to reform. There's no addict that just turns up of their own volition to say into rehab. Forget that willingness will ever exist. Any processes that design debt restructuring for Zimbabwe, any processes that attempt to make things better for Zimbabwe must be agnostic of the fact that this existing government will never be willing to reform. So let's look at stepped processes and procedures that remain agnostic of that. And for me, you find that a good starting point, instead of having things like, let's look at governance reform, let's look at bilateral, let's look at land, let's do it all at the same time. We really need a step process. For instance, there's the issue on human rights abuses. If you marry that against what has been put forward in economic reform pillars and governance reform pillars, you find that unless this is fully addressed first, unless we address the human rights situation in Zimbabwe, you cannot achieve the elements of the economic reform pillars and the governance reform pillars. And I'll give an example. There was a recently launched Gukurahundi Peace and Reconciliation Commission, I think a couple of weeks ago. And I understand that this is perhaps something that is a downstream outcome of the debt dialogue process. However, can we honestly say that we can speak of reconciliation commissions in a country where there is no freedom of expression, there is no freedom of association? How do you, in earnest, undertake a reconciliation commission under those circumstances? In terms as well of human rights abuses, because I think it was Beloved who talked of a debt trap. We're very much in a trap. And what happens in a trap is, even if you attempt to restructure from the top, you're continually filling that bucket with more debt. You're continually failing to bring value to address the debt situation. Human rights abuses have got their impact on in terms of economic costs. The idea of FDI coming into the country is limited. There's a ceiling we're not moving past. If you look at even our exports in the last 3 years, we are moving towards the same median year in, year out. It's not improving. You look at the social costs of what is happening. We've had a few examples being mentioned already in terms of individuals being persecuted and arrested, and the distrust and mistrust that brings in terms of the government institutions. How do you honestly sit in a dialogue session with government colleagues who have got such an erosion of trust? How do you trust that they will do what they're going to say they will do under such circumstances? And of course, the political cost in terms of international isolation. I don't believe that in terms of international actors and bilateral partners that are participating in this dialogue are actually doing this, with all sincerity, to be honest, because they will always treat Zimbabwe at an arm's length. They are not really willing to properly partner in order to address the issues and what has resulted in the debt crisis. So because we're in this situation that really is precipitated by the human rights abuses, it suggests to me that must be a starting point. Unless this is addressed, unless the courts, we have judicial reform, we cannot move past that. We cannot attack or address any other pillar without having addressed first the human rights abuses. The debt dialogue process speaks to accountability in Zimbabwe through the governance reforms, through the economic reforms, and even the land tenure reforms. But the first line of accountability in a country comes from suffrage. When the citizens of a country are free to vote, that is the first line of accountability. So to then start to say we want to look at institutional reform, we want to look at governance reform in a country where there's no right to vote seems to me disingenuous. I don't believe that that this is a process that is really going to achieve very much. Zimbabwe has got no line of defense against things like corruption. I think there was an estimate a couple of years ago. At that time, Zimbabwe was losing nearly $100 million a month to corruption. So these efforts around the technical efforts of debt restructuring will not achieve very much. We remain in that trap because we continue to lose the leakage through corruption and all the examples that Tendai Biti has mentioned before that come from whether it's overinflated contracting, fraudulent accounting. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe in itself is center to a lot of these corruption scandals. The Ministry of Finance being, I think they take on even signatory rights in terms of some of the contracts that we are seeing that are overinflated. So they are center to this. So unless we have, I would say, an address of the lines of defense against corruption, almost independently to a technical debt restructuring process, there's little to no value of such a process because we cannot defend ourselves against corruption. And the first line of defense is the citizens themselves, who should have the right to vote out governments that they see as not meeting their requirements in terms of addressing corruption and making best value of the public purse. The fact that our public financial management, we had the Audit General report, which shows that, I think more than 50% of local councils did not have finalized financial statements at the time of the Auditor General's report. We actually in the country do not have a substantial Auditor General. At the moment, we have an interim incumbent. So, and they are appointed directly by the president and so on and so forth. So we do not have any lines of defense against corruption. And really, these should be preliminary requirements before we can start thinking about debt restructuring from a technical perspective, before we can even start to think about the wider issue of reforms in governance, of reforms, even in terms of there's the issue on land tenure. Land tenure reforms, I've seen that this, and I stand corrected perhaps by Vera later on this, that this is directly related to the farmers that lost their land during the Jambanja and so on and so forth. But the idea of property rights in Zimbabwe is not being observed. We still have even the ordinary people that are being forced and evicted off their property without any compensation as well. So, you know, it's in terms of social protection, in terms of property rights, this doesn't exist. So it then says, why have we singled out a particular group outside of everyone else who is also being victim because of this lack of property rights in Zimbabwe? The idea of state institutions vis-a-vis resolution of bilateral investment protection. So one of the things that we observe with Zimbabwe and its borrowing is we have also what I think was coined in Zambia through this government of reckless lending. So, you know, you want to examine some of the debt. For instance, you look at the Hwange thermal power station and what has happened there. I think we've borrowed around 4 billion from China Exim Bank. But some of that it's been insisted which Chinese contractors we should be working with. I think Sino Hydro was one that we then awarded them a 3 billion contract. And then recently, I think they've been given equity of nearly over 30% of Hwange thermal power station in exchange for an equity loan. We have seen what has happened to the Decca pipeline, which I think we borrowed, was it 14 million or something? And that was inflated to nearly more than double by the Indian contractor that was then given the contract. And as long as we are not really also understanding our bilateral partnerships and looking to address the way state institutions interact with them, the way that we borrow, the way that we engage, we are not addressing what is core to the issues of what has landed us in this position. You know, we consider ZESA is I think actually all state-owned institutions. The last and the RBZ assumed more than $100 million debt from state-owned institutions. But you look at these state-owned institutions, they are marred with overinflated contract. We know ZESA has lost at least $865 million just from corruption, from overinflated contracts, from equipment that is bought but not being used, from investing $190 million in power projects in Mutare that just never achieved anything. The Dema Diesel Secunda Holdings project, which was given $170 million and nothing happened. You know, we've had over 500 million pounds of procurement irregularities. So with this kind of picture, how can you talk about resolution in the form of bilateral investments and in the form of governance reform and land tenure, etc., when we are still very much in this trap? Of course, I think, as Vera said, that there are some gains, but when you consider how the impact from a cost benefit assessment of, okay, can we actually put additional value add to these benefits vis-a-vis the current situation that Zimbabwe is in? Because for every marginal benefit achieved through this process, I believe that the loss continues, and the loss will continue to far outweigh any benefits, because we really need to be clear on a starting point. We must have a prelude to any kind of debt dialogue. I mean, yes, we have, as Tendai was saying, that potentially it's around 90% of our GDP. But even that is not the worst in the world in terms of, is the problem debt? Or is the problem governance? Is the problem systematic so much that any technical approach to debt restructuring, any benefits achieved from that will be far outweighed by the continued state plunder, the continued cost of human rights abuse, the continued lack of line of defense against corruption, which starts with bringing back suffrage rights into Zimbabwe. So this is what I would say, that if we were to take any lessons learned from such a process, is that It must be intentional, it must be genuine, and we must be clear on what the problem statement is, and then address it from that perspective. Because as things stand right now, you know, I mean, I was gobsmacked when Beloved said that the idea of governance reform, that was an afterthought. You know, elements of that should actually be the starting point. You cannot speak of debt restructuring. I'm
not
sure.
So
we could go on, of course, with. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I was hearing you, but you're breaking a bit, so I wasn't sure whether it was just me or. But you could
perhaps
also yeah.
Okay, so I'm not sure where I'd gotten to, but my point is, in summary, that we need a stepped process that must have preludes to the beginning of a debt dialogue position, because we cannot launch into technical debt restructuring before we've addressed the fundamentals, such as the suffrage rights, such as the human rights abuses. Without those two being addressed, any outcomes will be eroded by the cost of these two. Thank you.
Thank you, Chenai, and I think that you have been consistent and clear in proposing a stepped process to addressing the debt challenge in Zimbabwe. That the way we are approaching it would not work and would not yield results. And I think that some of the speakers on the panel are in agreement with the fact that we are unlikely to see results on this process. I think you put emphasis on the problem statement that either it was wrongly crafted or it has not been understood. But also I would add that I think Tendai touched on the Lima process, that it's quite clear that this process seemed to not have looked at why the other processes in the past had failed. And we see a repetition of the same things that caused the Lima process to collapse: the indiscipline in financial management, corruption, mismanagement of exchange rates, and all those things. And we see, as you put it, that the process doesn't seem to be genuine. And so I want to bring in Terence Chitapi, who is a Zimbabwean academic, and I know that he has been following this process. And Terry, it seems to me that, as Chenai is putting it, that this process possibly had a wrong starting point, that its beginning, it was flawed from the beginning, because it seems like, judging by this panel alone, that a lot of Zimbabweans don't have a lot of goodwill to the process. Can you help me mute Moses, Lily? Okay, thank you. So Tera, I want you to come in a bit, react to the inputs we have had, but also give us a bit into the original actors in this process. Where are they? Are they still in this process as a sign that they think they are making progress? Or a lot of people have developed cold feet over the success, the potential success of the process. But where do you see us going in terms of this process? I know that Tendai told us that Adesina's election is coming, and having been at the center of this process, we had how this process started when Adesina met with President Emerson, and in a way sort of agreed to start the process as the two of them, and the president took it to Parliament. Is the intention to really reform the debt in Zimbabwe? Because as we are talking, I think from 2022, the debt has been ballooning. The borrowing, I think Chenai covers it. The borrowing has been exponential. It's increasing at a rate that is alarming. money is being swindled, is being used outside parliamentary accountability process channels and all those things. Where are we? Can you come in and react?
Thanks very much, my brother Mujodzi, and morning to everyone. And thank you for organizing such a very important discussion, around issues which one way or the other do affect all of us. But before I give my very brief remarks, I would want to highlight to you one very important thing that anyone who is trying to make sense of this structured dialogue process must be aware of. And it is basically in terms of how the regime in Harare operates when it is under pressure. So if you look into the past and see how the government or the state in Zimbabwe reacts to external, internal pressure, it usually does so, by instituting some form of dialogue, whether it is with internal actors, whether it is with external actors, or a mixture of both. But it over the years, managed to use dialogue or the semblance of dialogue, as a pressure release valve when it feels that its power is threatened. So if you are aware of this modus operandi of this government, then you should be able to make sense of whatever overtures it does from time to time in terms of dialogue with whichever party that it enters into dialogue with. But I might just want to take you back, to when this process started in 2022. So between 2022 and 2023, I was working with key civil society actor, that was probably the first to question, the sincerity of the government when it instituted this process. So at that time, when the process started, even civil society was not part of this process. And I think at that time, we did write initially a letter to the AfDB, including its current and outgoing president, Dr. Adesina, to question really the motives of this dialogue when the dialogue was leaving out, the citizens. So for them, then we did question that this was probably just a way of the ruling elites within the state, getting these concessions with international creditors for them to be taken back on board into international financial circuits, which they've, I think, dearly missed because of their transgressions of the past. And of course, later on, we did make that letter public because the AfDB had not written back to us. So we did question, the sincerity of this dialogue process, when it did leave out the citizens. This is a national process, one that is trying to alleviate challenges on the economy, and then it leaves out a very, very critical component of whom it is trying to help. Immediately after that, which we suspect was also as a result of pressure from particularly the embassies and other diplomatic partners, we then see the coming in of a few civil society actors, or civil society organizations, I should say. They are roped into this process, and from within, they are then told to go and caucus with other, civil society organizations, the civil society in its broad sense, to get them on board. So with that mandate, those few civil society actors came and indeed they did convene a very big roundtable of civil society organizations to appraise us of this new development that the government wanted civil society into this process. And very much like Beloved did not, at the beginning when he gave his presentation, they emerged two opposing camps. In much the same way, there were the positivists who thought that this was an opportune moment to engage with government and you know, take the country forward. Of course, the idea of dialogue itself was a welcome move, but of course, there were also the skeptics who really thought that you know, the government was not sincere and you know, was trying to, you know, hoodwink everyone into, you know, lessening the pressure that was there on the government at the time. And you know, lo and behold, I think we were left really, you know, a divided lot. And there was that agreement, you know, to say, you know what, for those that really feel they can continue with this dialogue process, they are free to do so. And those that feel this dialogue process is not a sincere one can stay outside. But of course, we need to constantly meet on the sidelines to take stock of progress. And indeed, when we would take stock of progress, particularly based on the governance matrix of the dialogue process, we would find that you know, nothing was really moving. So if you look at, so most of this period was, you know, the period preceding the 2023 elections. You know, you would look at, you know, pillar number one. I think you were saying there were 5 pillars. There were actually 6 pillars. The first around enhancing justice delivery. You could clearly see as we were edging towards the 2023 August elections that the judicial space or the judiciary clearly
Apologies, Terry, apologies, colleagues, for that. Lily, can we take control of that? And can we please remove anyone who you have been telling to mute and they have not muted? So I want to apologize for that, and please, Terry, continue, and I think get to rounding off as well.
Okay, no, that's fine. So I will not go into detail about you know, the governance matrix and its pillars, but if you look at the way that the judiciary was acting around that pillar one of enhancing justice delivery, if you look at the public sector transparency and accountability, I think a lot of my colleagues have already talked about that. If you look at the third pillar around combating corruption, you know, it's self-evident. The issue around the promotion of human rights, a lot of my colleagues have already talked about that. Electoral reforms, which I think, you know, everyone was really looking at towards the 2023 election. And the last one around national unity, peace, and reconciliation, which I think Chennai rightly points out that the current process around, you know, the Gukura Wunti hearings is actually in response to this. But just a cursory look at all those indicators and where we are, you know, in terms of meeting them or lack thereof, it's clear, you know, that the government seems not very sincere, you know, towards addressing this, because right now, because the elections are passed, there isn't so much pressure, you know, in terms of threatening their hold on to power, and which is why I think Tendai rightly notes that at the present moment, you know, those that structured dialogue process, I think also with the coming to an end of Dr. Adesina's STEM at the AfDB may as well spell the death knell of this structured dialogue process. Also noting that the very genesis of this dialogue process, like Chennai rightly notes, was not a sincere process. So we were told, I think about 2-3 weeks back by one of the consultants, that was hired as part of this process. So Dr. Adesina meets the president at one of these conferences. They talk about, these challenges. And I think it's clear that at some point he did negotiate for himself, that consultant, to try and help Zimbabwe wriggle out of its debt challenges. So you actually find that rather than this just being, an AfDB led process, this was a consultancy, that had quite a number of consultants, including the AfDB president and others, contracted by the government of Zimbabwe to act as intermediaries in negotiating themselves out of this debt. So at that level alone, you can actually see that this was never really a genuine process towards dealing with the debt challenge. And like we did not weeks back, Munjodzi, I think the death of the social contract in Zimbabwe has been at the core of the genesis of the debt crisis itself. And for as long as that social contract is dead, we cannot talk about any debt resolution process that can succeed in Zimbabwe. And for as long as that social contract is dead, we can never get any progress that is meaningful out of this process. I know my time is limited. I would be happy to engage again through the questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks, Terry, so much. I think that you touch on a number of important issues. And I think for me, the death of a social contract, the absence of a social contract between in Zimbabwe is clearly a fundamental issue that has to be addressed, or has to be an objective of the processes that you are trying to do, and to be able to successfully construct that compact or contract. You clearly need to bring as many people on board as is possible. And I think from the discussions, it's quite clear that there are a lot of ingredients that are missing to be able to bring about a proper social contract where people believe that what you are doing is genuinely to address the challenges that the country is facing. The role of the Africa Development Bank, you touch on that, and the idea of contracts, people just seeking consultants to try and help is also an important aspect. Why Adesina? Why Chisano? Why not the others? Where did that come from? So I think the origin of this process is problematic in every sense, at least from what we are hearing from the panels. And what we try to do here at SALO is to build consensus, not for people to agree, but to have every viewpoint be put on the table so that those who have power and some leverage to help push the Zimbabwean issue towards a more democratic, more open society can do so from an informed point of view. And that's why we try to bring different voices, those that are in the know, those that are supposed to be part of the process. I see that Honorable Chidua has not been able to join, so I guess he did not get the clearance from Parliament, which is unfortunate because I think his voice would have been critical. I want to quickly open this briefly to get direct questions or brief inputs to the panelists before we come back to a few of the panelists. I won't be able to pick everyone because I want to allow Prof. Brian Raftopoulos to really just react and close the meeting for us in the coming few minutes. So if there are burning questions, burning inputs, I think that this is the time. as people are thinking through. Sorry, Lily, what's the problem?
No, well, I have muted everybody, so I'd have to unmute them if they want to come in. But I'm just explaining that if someone wants to raise their hand to come in, then at the bottom of your some people's Zoom has updated, so it's changed a bit. So if you want to know how to raise your hand, where it says react, there's like a heart picture, and you click on that, and then that will allow you to raise your hand.
Okay, no, that's fine. So as we prepare our questions, Vera, give us a sense of what has been happening in the past year, possibly in terms of the high-level meetings. Have you guys been able to have the high-level meetings? But like now in 2024, what exactly has been happening in terms of the process? Briefly, before we allow Lwazi and a few others, just to get a sense of what it is that you have been doing in the recent past. Was I think Tendai raised the issue that to confirm that this process is dead, there hasn't been any serious meetings, particularly the high-level meetings that are attended by the president. Has the minister been attending? What have you been doing in the recent past?
Okay, great. Thank you again for that, Mundodzi, and thank you to all the previous speakers. Before I go into that, I was noting some of the major concerns that they have, and if you'll allow me just a few extra minutes, I'll try to address just a few. So first and foremost, to my Muzukuru Tendai, the process is not dead, I assure you. In fact, the process is moving forward. I say that because one, I think there remains commitment, and I think that was an issue that was also raised by the international community to keep this going. In fact, the international community has been heavily involved. I know the US suspended, they did not depart from the process. So I just want to assure everybody that even AfDB, we had a meeting with the director of AfDB just 2 weeks ago to assess how the process is going, what else we can do. The director was consulting us as civil society on progress. So rest assured that the commitment from the key players remains there and the process is not dead. Now, I think a big question for all of us is political versus technical, right? And like you said, Mundodzi, I think a part of it could have been how this was conceptualized, and Chennai mentioned it as well, and Beloved, right from the beginning. I think, Terry, you touched on it. Now, initially, there was no technical. There was very little technical. There was a lot of political, but the political was not yielding the necessary results. So in relation to the governance track, it was felt that we needed a highly technical group that would guide and measure progress in a systemic and methodological way. So hence, the reason why the technical was introduced this year. So this is a recent development, and I think it touches on what you asked, Mundodzi. What has happened this year? We developed a highly technical group that it will assess whether or not progress and measure whether or not progress is actually being made. So I think that's a critical issue. We can always, go back and forth, political, technical, but I just wanted to highlight that because of the political challenges, it felt, there was a consensus that we needed to go technical. We needed to go to what is reform? What are the key components of reform and how do we get there? So I just wanted to quickly highlight that. So ownership, pessimists, versus, those who are optimistic. I think we have seen some of the pessimists start coming on board. And one of the things that I want to emphasize is there has to be confidence in this process. And confidence will only come from us participating. Those of us who are involved have been pushing for government to open up to more actors, key players in Zimbabwean society, in our country. And that has already started to happen. So whereas we started with only a few civil society organizations, we now have many, many more. And those, like Terry mentioned, those who previously might even have been opposed to this process are now part and parcel of the technical groups and are now part and parcel of the consultation. So I think that's another key issue that I just wanted to highlight. Key learnings, yes, you're right, Tendai. I mean, you talked about security sector, that security sector might have been overlooked. I think in many ways we have been incorporating it in the other tracks. You heard me mention earlier that the last meeting we had on the judiciary included the Zimbabwe Republic Police. And we asked the police about, what's going on in terms of detention, arrests, and we really took the Zimbabwe Republic Police to task to say, can you help us understand what happens when there are incidences that are raised either about, misconduct by the police during an arrest? What does the ZRP do in that situation? And the assistant commissioner responded to us, telling us that the ZRP has an internal unit that does investigations when there are incidences of misconduct by police officers. So whilst the security sector at large is not there, there are elements of it. But I do agree with you, Tendai, that it's a key issue in our country. And I think that's obviously something we will reflect upon as the technical group and continue to incorporate from whatever angle we can. I think just a couple of other issues. So a lot of what everybody's describing, SADC, elections, all of that is in it. It is in the matrix. So the
I think your network
sharing of information widely on.
Okay, you can
last year, what have we done? So we have met under those different themes, thematic areas that I described. And Terry, they are 5. So transparency and accountability and anti-corruption are 1. Okay, so it's not 6, it's 5. But under those themes, we have been meeting regularly with the relevant ministries and stakeholders in government to try and address what progress there has been in those specific areas. So whether it's unity and reconciliation, Chennai, like you described, we have been talking about. Whether it's economic governance, Tendai, you touched on a couple of critical issues, the exchange rate, successful implementation of an SMP, establishing a competitive foreign exchange rate, macroeconomic stability, issues of quasi-fiscal activities or ending unbudgeted expenditure. All of that is in the economic group. I mean, if we had more time, I would have highlighted to you what has happened on some of those issues. Maybe I'll just touch on one, successful implementation of an SMP. There was engagement this year in January and in February on developing a broad framework around SMP. So looking at policies, looking at reforms, and looking at the framework for exchange rate and the framework for monetary policies. There was also an IMF mission that was scheduled for the SMP discussions as well. So there are things that are happening. A lot is happening. I think, like I said, unfortunately, it is not being shared. And it goes to what you ended on as well, Munjotsi, and what Terry touched on. Where are citizens in this? Where is the communication on what is happening? Where is the information sharing? So the political level is where it's all supposed to go up to. That's where it all goes up to. After we, the technical folks, have actually analyzed, are we on track with specific indicators and specific targets for all of this? So a political meeting has been planned, but I think time was given to allow the technical groups to assess and to push to say, government, what are you doing under all these key reforms that need to be implemented? So I will end perhaps in saying, Munjodzi, we all agree. So there is consensus that the debt situation is unsustainable. So if not this, then what is my question? This is one of the attempts to ensure that we deal with the real issues in our country. There are other complementary processes that are underway, and maybe I'll leave us there. What are the complementary processes we need in our country to ensure that this stays on track? Because it certainly cannot be the only one. So what are we all doing on the sidelines to complement this process to ensure that it remains on track? Because like everybody said, of course, time is of essence. Time is an issue. And maybe I'll end there and allow time for further deliberation.
Thanks, Vera. And I know that you come in for a closing shot because I think some of the things that you respond to are important to really understand. I think communication from your end as part of the people who are in this process is quite important. But also, I think from what Terry was doing, looking at the intentions of those that initiated this process, and I think he argues that this was just a pressure valve that was opened to release some pressure when the government was under pressure. And I think on your parting shot, I would want to hear on the sincerity of those that instituted this process from where you stand. Are you seeing that sincerity? Are you seeing the willingness to really do the needful and take this process forward? I think everyone else seemed to suggest that that would not be true. I want to bring in Lwazi, but also I want to ask Tendai to look in the chat. I think Dr. Shawaz put a question. If you're able to look at that, and then I'll take Lwazi and take one more question if there is anyone else. I see there are a number of people that are in the meeting: Ambassador Mandisi, Sis Miriam, Prof. Mo, and a few others. Please, if you have questions, either in the chat or just raise your hand and come in. We want to go to the speakers to just conclude after Lwazi and whoever will come on board. Lwazi.
Thank you so much, Munjodzi. Thank you so much to the panelists for a very enlightening discussion today. I have, for the sake of time, I have two questions, right? Since the US has suspended its participation in this process, what have been the efforts to have them re-engaging in this process, including some of the reforms that they've highlighted that are necessary for their re-engagement? My secondary question is the involvement of the African Union and SADC as a regional institution. We understand countries such as South Africa have a large percentage in the African Development Bank in terms of a 5% shareholdership. What has been the involvement of countries such as South Africa and along with other creditors in ensuring that this process is a success? Thank you so much to SALO for facilitating this dialogue, and I thank you to the panelists for enlightening us about this process. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Laz. I think very important questions. If there is no other question, Lily, do we have any other question or another hand? Or if not, I want to quickly get back to the speakers so you respond to some of the things that you might have picked during the discussion, but also give us your parting shot and also try to answer those three questions, the two from Lwazi and I think one from Dr. Shawaz. Let me start with Tendai and and say that, of course, at the level you have been looking at it, the role of AU and SADC in this process, are they key actors in the process? If not, why? And if there is a role for them to play, because we know that the Zimbabwean crisis burdens its neighbors more than it does those that are far. And so you would think that when you're putting together actors for this kind of a dialogue, the neighbors would be people that you bring, but also South Africa and Zimbabwe in terms of the balance of trade and all those things, we seem to trade more with South Africa. So is it playing a role? But also I think Shawaz had a question on where is the overspending going to? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, no, I think you can go ahead and then give us your parting shot. Also, Vera sort of puts on the table that the process is very much alive and that they are working to bring success.
Well, the issue really is yes, meetings are being held. There's no question about it. But does the government actually believe that it can reform? Does anyone seriously believe that this government can reform? I mean, I was reading yesterday that some people were picked out from aeroplane going to Victoria Falls, for Christ's sake. 3 young activists. That's the government which we are dealing with. So, with great respect, this process is dead by the shouting, and it's dead because this government is not capable of implementing the reforms that are required to persuade people to cancel their indebtedness, to forgive what is owed to them. Remember, Zimbabwe owes a lot of money. They say 21 billion. Some think it's as high as $42 billion. But the creditors that matter are the African Development Bank, $2 billion, the Paris Club of Lenders, about 5.7 billion, the African Development Bank, about 600 million, then the Republic of China, where some think it's as high as $13 billion. With regards to traditional Western debt, you are asking governments, you're asking taxpayers of foreign current countries to cancel their indebtedness. So they will do that through a process that is transparent and a process that requires commitment and proof beyond reasonable doubt that a government is reforming and that a government will not place itself in the same position it was, which made it to default. And for that reason, Zimbabwe can't reduce this thing to a technical exercise. Zimbabwe can't think that it can whitewash and blindside the creditors. They can't. Then there's the question of the role of SADC and the African Union and so forth. Now, Zimbabwe is not the first country to be in debt distress. In fact, the dominant economics of the 90s, of the late 80s, was actually African countries with debt, countries like Nigeria, countries in the west of Africa, and so forth. The majority of them went through HIPC exercise. It's bilateral. You negotiate on your own. You negotiate your own staff-mentored program. You negotiate your own quantitative and qualitative targets. Take Zambia next door. Zambia is actually going through this painful process. And one of the things that Zambia is learning, which Zimbabwe is going to learn very soon, is that China is not prepared to have the same formula that you traditionally apply in the HIPC process, and that sometimes negotiations with China are in fact more complex than negotiations with Washington, negotiations with the Paris Club of lenders and so forth. So it's essentially a subjective country process where SADC, where the African Union has got little say. The African Development Bank can play a role, a technical role, providing you with expertise and technical assistance. They've always stood on the side of Zimbabwe, starting with Donald Kaberuka. When I was in government, I worked closely with Donald Kaberuka. Their voice is important because they carry weight in the multilateral status quo. But despite the goodwill you have from an African president, whether it's Adesina or Kaberuka, you still have to go through the essentials. And the essentials are that you reform at a macro level, you reform at a macro level, you reform at a political level. And we are failing to do that. Remember, the process involves 2 stages. the decision process and the completion process. The decision-making process is, have you passed the macroeconomic test, the quantitative targets, the qualitative targets, of the high standards that are required of an upper tier SMP. Then you go to the completion stage, which is now politics. Are you not beating up opponents? Are you not stealing elections? Are you not stealing resources? Do you have militias running in the country? How close is the military to the seat of power? You have to answer those hard questions. And if you fail to answer those hard questions, you won't pass. And quite clearly, Zimbabwe is failing to answer even basic hygiene issues. For Christ's sake, who arrests activists a week before in an important SADC summit? Only a self-serving morbid regime with suicidal elements can do that. I've been asked, where is this money going? When I chaired the Public Accounts Committee, one of the reasons why the debt, the debt assumption, the financial adjustment bill of 2019 for $10.6 billion died, is that we insisted on the audit. Don't tell us you've spent 10.7 billion. Don't tell us you've spent 534 billion or 8.7 trillion. Show us where the money is actually gone. Regrettably, a lot of the money is going to opaque processes. I want to give you one example. In 2017, $2.7 billion was literally stolen, was missing, was spent unapproved. When we dug deeper, we discovered that 1.5 billion had disappeared on the 27th of December 2017. And some people believe that there were actually physical payments made to people who had played a role during the 2017 November coup. I could be wrong, I could be right. It doesn't matter. What matters is that there needs to be forensic audit of these amounts that are being spent outside Parliament, so that Zimbabweans can know the truth of where the money is going to. It can't be going to legitimate purposes, because legitimate purposes are budgeted for and are provided for in the appropriation account. And if you have any other legitimate reason to spend money which was not covered by Parliament, the Constitution in Section 305 allows you to go to Parliament and ask for approval of supplementary estimates. This has not been happening. Where is the money going? That's $1 million question. I'll stop here, Jones.
Yeah, thanks, Mkom. I think that helps matters. I think importantly, the issue of the decision process and what will be happening and the completion stage. But also just trying to marry, and I think this will be an issue for those that are in the process, just trying to marry the reality on the ground today, as you highlight that who arrests people that are not even going out of the country or coming into the country. They are moving from one part of the country to another in a plane, and you arrest them on the eve of a SADC summit. But we are also seeing, and Vera, I think this is for you, a massive crackdown. It seems like the statements from government are clear that people are not allowed to protest, and that's a worry. I'm not sure how you guys interact with day-to-day developments in the process itself. What do you do when these things continue to happen and you are sitting every day to push a process forward that should be able to address these things? Before Prof. Raft comes in, I wanted to ask Bila and Chennai 1 minute each to just give your parting shots. Beloved, are you still in?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Confirm you can hear me, Mujodzi.
We can hear you, man.
Okay, thank you. I want to add two dimensions to the debate. The first one is around factionalism within the ruling party itself. You will see that there are seemingly conflicting interests of the different factions, which at times cause disharmony in the way that the wheels of the regime turn in the process. So I think let's also have that at the back of our mind. And then the second one is to buttress Terry's point around the consultancy and stuff. So this is a project with a budget and a blog frame. So the AfDB is treating it as such. So we should narrow down our expectations and know that in terms of their success levels, is the log frame which would determine whether they have succeeded or not. So for AfDB, this is a project which is just run by like any other project on the basis of their budget. And I'm happy that Terry also mentioned that civil society came later on, after Chisano had come and in his consultations realized that they had been left out. So you will see that the conceptualization of government into this process, going into it, it was a process to hoodwink the West into thinking that they are prepared to reform, which did not succeed. These guys, they invest a lot in intelligence analysis. They were aware that they are falling into a mind trap. And the last point is that the behavior of government and the ruling party specifically has validated and emboldened the skeptics who had, from the onset, told the optimists that this regime is not going to change. So they have just validated why skeptics were skeptical. And in the process, they've even been able to move some pessimists who were either at the center or to the left, right to their side, in terms of their disbelief in the incapacity and lack of desire by ZANU-PF to reform. In fact, there is an ideological mismatch between the ruling elites' conceptualization of how they must rule and the governance framework to what is anticipated by our friends in the West. There is really a mismatch. These guys, they don't believe in democracy. And I think we need to treat ZANU-PF as such. Thank you.
Thank you, Bila. Chennai, in a minute.
Yes, I will make this very quick, Munjozi. So I think essentially, without raining on Vera's parade, we are asking the government essentially to come to the table and mark their own homework and do their corrections. And I don't believe that this is going to happen. I think they will continue to tick the box. They will continue to push the papers. But this isn't going to achieve as much as we would like. I've just seen a case come up now, just a minute ago, from Mozambique, where the Debt Justice Network have actually gone to litigate where they've had debt scandals over 3 billion, and they've actually won that case in an international court. So these are some of the things that I think if we had a genuine civic society, genuine partners wanting to address the situation in Zimbabwe, then they really need to go for it. To say that we're going to have the government at the table, we're going to discuss, I worry that this is going to be a paper-pushing exercise that will claim to reap benefits that will just overly be an insult in the face of Zimbabweans who are having to live through the impact of this debt of overhang on a daily basis, the impact of the human rights abuses. Without suffrage, you cannot begin any form of dialogue that seeks to have accountability and transparency as an outcome, because that is your first line of defense. So as long as that is not addressed, as long as Zimbabweans cannot vote freely, that process is hugely flawed, and any benefits will be slightly marginal and really do not weigh much against the costs, the continued costs of this on the people of Zimbabwe.
Thanks, Chennai. And I think you then touch on an important issue that I think we'll try to bring Mtuli and a few others from government on this process in the coming weeks or so to try and unpack it, because we think it's an important issue, the issue of debt. Zimbabweans have to get answers at some point. But I think you touch on the important issues. What is the cost of this process to the people of Zimbabwe? And Vera in a minute, then Terry in a minute. Just parting shots. Vera.
Thank you so much, Munjodzi. I think I will end on two issues in my parting shots. The first one is around ownership, right? This is a national process. We are the citizens of this nation. And we keep talking about ownership. Who does ownership lie with? My humble submission is it lies with all of us, right? Like I said, I acknowledge there's a disconnect between communication being shared, and certainly that's something that needs to be corrected. But we want to see everybody come to that table at some stage. We want to see these conversations being involved and included. So it is us, is the first thing I will say. We must take ownership. The second thing I will say is, and I'll end on, is the issue of the decision-making around this, the political. The political and technical are designed to go hand in hand, not to be separate, to be complementary to each other. Like I said, there was, it was one of the lessons learned tonight, you talked about lessons, was that there was something that was missing. There was a missing piece from all of that. We added the missing piece. The missing piece is supposed to deal with the reality, like everybody touched on, everything that's going on right now, right? How do we include that? How is it factored into this process? Unfortunately, we do not meet regularly. It's something I will raise as well with the team. But rest assured, even yesterday, I was raising these issues with everybody who's involved. So it's not that these issues are not being factored in, the environment, the current environment, and what everybody is witnessing in the country right now. Rest assured that everything is being factored in, and there will be complementarity, and there already is complementarity between the political and the technical. I'll end there. Thanks, Munjodzi.
Thanks, Vera. Thanks so much. Terry, in a minute. Terence. I think
okay, yeah, all right, yeah, I'll be very brief. So in a nutshell, George, I think the broad characterization of the government, as has been described, by those who have been trying to see its what it has done on the government reforms and on the economic reforms, the grant corruption and so forth. This is a competitive authoritarian system, and we need to be alive to the tactics that it uses to continue with its stranglehold on power. So part of what we are clearly seeing, George, is this superficial move to feign a process of dialogue, which they are clearly not so much invested in. I think like we did not, there isn't so much pressure on them now. They've just managed to manipulate the last election and possibly going to be ended the chairpersonship of SADC, which is a very strong indictment on the democratic processes that we all seek to see. And if we are not careful, particularly on the civil society side, I think we may end up, just to borrow from David Moore, being patriotic positivists, who want to see the positive where it is not there. Clearly, from what is happening in the country, there is nothing that points to the government being sincere towards meeting its own benchmarks. Is put out in the governance reform matrix and the economic reform matrix. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Terry. And from me, I think thanks to Vera, Mkoma Tendai, Chennai, Bila, and of course, Terry for those massive inputs. And I think that for me, this is a discussion that we must continue to have among other discussion topics because it is important to really be able to unpack this. But from what is clear inside Zimbabwe, it seems like there will be a lot of efforts to muzzle people from speaking, and that becomes a problem. So we'll continue to avail these platforms. I want to bring in our board member, Prof. Raft, to talk to us and then close the meeting.
Thank you, Munjozi, and thank you to all the speakers for really insightful interventions. Pardon my voice, got a bit of a cold. Clearly, what's been set out here is the deepening authoritarianism in Zimbabwe, the deepening, long-term deepening of the economic crisis, and there seems to be no way out of it at the moment, and the tensions between the strategy of how to deal with it. I think Vera has clearly pointed to the importance of claiming a space while it's there and using that space when it's there, where against Tendai's notion that this issue is dead. But I think those two debates are not contradictory. They don't necessarily have to be set apart. Both need to have alternatives. If you go into a dialogue and you know that and you can see that dialogue is not going anywhere, you need to think, and the constraints are there, what are the alternatives to that? And for Vera and the group involved in that, they need to think about. On the other hand, for those who dismiss this as dead in the water, they also have to think, what are the alternatives to that? So discussing the tensions and the possibilities of the two sides of that debate, I think is important. Secondly, the deepening corruption. Zimbabwe is not particular in that sense. Throughout developing countries, as many political economists have pointed out, corrupt states tend to keep their stability not primarily through fiscal policy, as Mushtaq Khan says, but through selectively accommodation of factions along patron-client lines. And we're seeing that in Zimbabwe. But I also want to point to two things that were not being mentioned here. One is that one of the problems with the pressure coming from the West is the declining credibility of Western narrative on democracy. And this is in particular in relation to the complicity of particular Western countries like the US in the ongoing genocide on Palestinians. When you have this kind of situation, to push for a democratic dialogue in particular countries becomes almost a double standard. Because as we've seen historically, international law has never been universal, but very selective, and often in the name of empire. So when we see these double standards around international law and the global standards, including the standards around debt, being selectively applied, then that provides a certain legitimacy to authoritarian narratives like the Mnangagwa regime to say, who are you to speak to us about democracy? So one needs to look not only at the authoritarian nationalism, authoritarian structures at national level, but also the decline of the democratic narrative at international level. And that's how that is affecting the discussions on debt. So to look at a broader picture, and that brings me to SADC. We know that SADC, of course, is not homogeneous, but the central narratives of SADC are still liberation, solidarity, and national sovereignty. And that will be retained for the foreseeable future, especially with Mnangagwa coming into the chair. There's not likely to be much pressure on the Zimbabwe government. We've seen that the SIAC report on the elections is likely to be sidelined, and that's not going anywhere. And so what's also, again, back to the international level, what happens if you have a Trump government, Trump presidency coming into power in November of this year? I recently read a paper from two ambassadors, high-level ambassadors in the US, who are advising that Biden administration to view Zimbabwe through the lens of a democratic security paradox. In that case, they argue, the US Department of State may intend to forge a very different kind of relationship with the government of Zimbabwe, one based solely on shared security interests. We shouldn't be surprised if Western countries, given the double standards on democratization and international law, enter more transactional relationships with authoritarian governments. It wouldn't be the first time in US history. So these are the broader questions that any debate on this debt discussion has to take into account. There's also the question of how has the opposition responded? We've seen the systematic dismantling of the opposition by the Zimbabwe state, and this has been going on for a long time. But this has also been because of internal strategic mistakes made by the opposition. So when there's no sense of a strategic uniform narrative coming out of the opposition of alternatives around these kind of questions. It's one thing to critique the regime. It's another to build a longer term position. And we know that's been very difficult given the role of the military, given the role that they've used people, like Chavangu, to reduce the majority or to reduce the position of the opposition in parliament. But we also know there's been internal challenges within the opposition. One of the things I think that really needs to happen, even if it's something that needs to happen confidentially, there needs to be a critical debate on the long-term history of the opposition and the way forward. And that includes looking at civil society. So just to summarize, I think this problem of the debt issue brings into question not just the problem of the authoritarian state in Zimbabwe, which is clear, but also the broader challenges at international, regional level around debt, the debt issue, around the double standards on democratization, and what does this mean for the future of the democratic debate in the global south. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. I would ask,
Thank you very much, Prof, for those excellent closing remarks. Thank you very much to Mujodzi for your excellent chairing, and also thank you to everyone who has joined this meeting. And we'd also like to thank Norway for the support in making this dialogue happen. And thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day further.